Hello, I'm Jonathan Samet, speaking to you from the University of Southern California in Los Angeles, California, on behalf of Green Cross. I'm pleased to be able to tell you about lessons learned from the Fukushima disaster as you consider the issue of nuclear power. By way of background, I'm a physician and I also work in public health and have been involved in investigating the health consequences of radiation for 3 decades now, originally focusing on uranium miners and their risk of lung cancer from ionizing radiation underground, but more recently turning to other issues and working with Green Cross on trying to better understand and address the long-term consequences of the Chernobyl and Fukushima disasters. Again, I'm sorry I can't be with you today in Brasília as you gather information about this important issue in your seminar. Now, there have been many nuclear disasters, some large and well-known, and some quite small and more obscure. This map shows a plot of some of those disasters, the red circles, and of course there are many. There are many nuclear reactors and other nuclear devices in operation, and there have been things that have gone wrong, as you know, and as you know also, things can go very, very wrong. This table comes from a paper that I'm going to give you the reference for. It's from the Lancet, a medical journal, and there was a series of articles on Fukushima and also addressing Chernobyl to an extent, and such disasters in general. Here are listed 5 of the largest, most serious disasters. One in the Urals in Russia, the Keshtim disaster in the 50s, Windscale in the UK, 3 Mile Island, of course, in the United States, and then Chernobyl and Fukushima. And this table is useful. You may take some time to study it because it tells you what happened with each of these in general and what the population was exposed to and who was exposed. Now, there are multiple ways that a nuclear disaster can cause harm. The best known, of course, is radiation, very high levels of radiation exposure that particularly workers might be at risk for, can cause radiation sickness and even death. And of course, there's the immediate psychological stress, perhaps of evacuation, knowing that there's a nuclear disaster in progress. And there may be short-term consequences, anxiety, depression from being displaced, and then longer-term psychological consequences as shown in the bottom half of the slide. Of course, radiation exposure increases risk for cancer, and perhaps less well known is that we're now finding evidence, particularly from the atomic bomb survivors, that there may be consequences for increased risk of cardiovascular disease, heart disease as well. And then, as I mentioned, long-term risk for depression, anxiety, and PTSD, that is post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, again, from this same idea of broad consequences of a nuclear disaster, here are listed many, and you'll note that, of course, death is included on the list. That did happen in Chernobyl. Radiation exposure, the general exposures and concern to contaminated foods, an important issue, particularly around children who may be exposed to I-131. So again, as we think about what might happen after a nuclear disaster, don't just think radiation and cancer, which is where much of our thinking usually goes. Again, back to the Lancet and lessons learned, this diagram sketches out elements of what could happen with a nuclear disaster and then what is needed to manage the disaster, ranging from monitoring, finding out what people are exposed to, evacuation, giving iodine to protect the thyroid glands, particularly of children, the many different issues related to decontamination, mental health care, helping healthcare providers understand what they need to do, and being prepared. So there's a lot in this diagram simply signaling that there's an awful lot to think about around the context of a nuclear disaster. Now we're going to turn to the Fukushima disaster, a most unfortunate occurrence reflecting the confluence of the earthquake, the tsunami, and then the failures of safeguards at the plants at Fukushima Daiichi. So here was an opportunity to hope that we can do better than what followed at Chernobyl. At Fukushima, as elsewhere, there was concern about the psychological consequences, the mental stress. Every culture has a way of dealing with such problems, and they certainly were important and have remained important for Japan. So what happened, of course, I mentioned already the failure of the cooling systems when the ability to generate auxiliary power was ended because of the flooding of the generators, the meltdown, the release of cesium-134 and 137, of course, I-131, which is taken up into the thyroid gland, and more than 150,000 people evacuated, some never to return to their homes. There were immediate challenges and, of course, ongoing challenges as we enter the 5th year after the disaster. And again, there's still decontamination efforts underway. There's the challenge faced at the plant of contaminated water, very, very, very large quantities. And of course, people are still displaced, and some are in quite minimal housing settings. At Fukushima, as at Chernobyl, the cleanup workers were the most exposed, many reaching occupational exposure limits for radiation. And an epidemiological study, a follow-up study of the cleanup workers has been started to look towards finding any adverse health consequences of their exposure. So at Fukushima, like Chernobyl, of course, the highest group was, the exposed group was the workers. Now, the cancer problem is the best studied aspect of radiation exposure. We have ways to assess the risks. Given some understanding of what people were exposed to, we can calculate the doses of radiation that affected their body. We understand the risks of cancer that are linked to a particular quantity of radiation, and we can project out how many extra cases of cancer will occur. And we know that there's no safe level of radiation exposure. We think that any extra radiation exposure causes some increased risk of cancer. So we have the tools for looking at the cancer burden. We apply them. And in the case of these disasters, some people do have substantially higher exposures than they would have. Fortunately, in general, the general population will have a lower exposure because the radiation is diluted away from the plant. But the total extra burden on the population may still be substantial. So one cancer, of course, of particular concern is thyroid cancer in children because of the uptake of I-131 into the thyroid gland. So this slide shows data on thyroid cancer in children in Belarus and the Ukraine. And what I want you to notice is this Belarus, the rise of thyroid cancer that occurred about 5 years after the disaster. So it did not occur immediately, but occurred relatively short term. And fortunately now that there's been a downturn in that curve. But that's certainly a concern with the Fukushima disaster. And it's one that has been looked at through thyroid cancer screening. So with the children at risk around Fukushima, there has been extensive screening of the thyroid glands of the children using ultrasound testing to find any masses within the thyroid. And here's some data reported through 2014 And there were thyroid cancers found at a relatively short interval after the disaster. So more than 300,000 children actually screened, or people screened, and the second screening is in progress. Now we have a very, and these are some data on the radiation exposures and the age at diagnosis of the cases. And again, you can see these are all, many of the cases are in individuals who are still relatively young. So this first wave of testing, we did find cancers, didn't have a good, clear comparison. Now there's a more recent paper that was just out quite recently that used this same screening data and also looked at the first follow-up data, the first data from the second screening. So in this paper, they were able to look at those who were negative at the first screen and then see what happened at the second screen. And here's some of the data. Now this is a complicated table, but what it does show is that the rates of thyroid cancer in children at this point, 2014-15, look higher than they should be. Thyroid cancer is a relatively rare disease, and in fact, if we take the rate that we're guessing is what it's going to be in Fukushima and make a comparison to Japan overall, this very initial look suggests that the rates are about 30-fold higher. That's what this shows. So these are the rates in different areas, the nearest area, middle area from the plant, and the least contaminated area, showing the comparison to what we would expect from Japan altogether. So seems like there's an increase. This is a first look, but certainly of concern. WHO has done reports on the health consequences. When we use these risk tools that I mentioned for cancer, there are estimates there'll be some extra cancer. Even for those with the highest doses, there'll be an increase of perhaps several percent, and those exposed in infancy may have the greatest risk. And then, of course, they discuss the workers. But you might notice what I highlighted under mental health. The psychological impact of the Fukushima accident may outweigh other health consequences, and that's an important lesson from Chernobyl. Now, we have done a report working with Green Cross, just trying to get a sense of how many people were exposed to the plant. Now, as a consequence of the disaster, to radiation. So you could, on the one hand, say that many people were exposed, people all across Japan worried about their exposure to radiation from the disaster. But on the other hand, what we tried to do was get at those for whom the radiation monitoring indicated that they had actually been exposed. So we used maps of how the plume of radiation traveled after the disaster, and that is what is shown here in this color, the lighter color indicating the spread of radiation. It did reach to Tokyo. Now, of course, the dose was far lower. The dose rate was far lower than what was experienced at around the plant at Fukushima. So the red would be the highest, and the deep blue would be the lowest. So you can see, of course, the exposure rates, the dose rates were highest adjacent to the plant. But when we put all those numbers together, our figure was that the number exposed to extra radiation could be as high as 32 million people. Of course, many people were evacuated, and some will not return to their homes, as I mentioned. And the psychological and non-cancer problems are going to be the major health consequences from the disaster. So let me close by pointing you to a few resources. Our report is available online, and I would also refer you to this issue of The Lancet, a leading worldwide medical journal that has an important series of articles on Fukushima and radiation disasters in general. And I think there you'll find sort of more scientific facts, of course, than I could put into this very brief presentation. So I'm sorry I can't be with you to make this presentation in person, and if I can be of assistance as you consider nuclear power in Brazil, please reach out to me and contact me. Thank you.